Greetings, and welcome to the basement. We're going to continue looking at terrains, this time focusing on keeping the players away from the edge of the world. You really don't want the players reaching the edge of the world. It doesn't look right, it makes your game look very unprofessional, and yeah, it's just not good. Don't let players walk off or even reach the edge of your world. Just don't do it. So, how can we stop players from reaching the edge of the world or seeing it or anything to do with it? There's actually quite a few different techniques we can use for this. One of the more common techniques is to reserve a certain portion of the edge of your terrain as non-walkable areas. It's there, you've worked on it, but you have no intentions of letting the player actually walk on that part. It's just there for visual looks. So that's what we're going to focus on. Now here's a terrain that I have created beforehand. I did this using the Terrain Toolkit. If you want to see the numbers I used, I am using Perlin generation, frequency 4, amplitude 0.08, octaves 6, and blend 1. And then I just hit the Generate Perlin Terrain button a couple of times until I got something that I was reasonably happy with. So I've got this terrain. Now how do I know where the edge of my world is? Oh, and before I forget, the size of the terrain itself, I did modify it. This is a 700 by 700 terrain. So it's 700 wide, 700 long. It's not the standard 500 by 500. And we'll see why in a bit. So, but I've got this terrain here, but how do I know what my boundary area is? What areas do I want to make sure that the player can't reach? Well, I can use textures to help guide me on this. So we're going to take a look at creating textures and bringing them in for the terrain editor. Just fairly simple guide textures. These are in no way, shape, or form intended to be included with release products. So hopping over to GIMP, let's see here. Oh, and I still have some of my old stuff up from previously, so let me clear this out. I'm going to start off with a basic 128 by 128 image. And we're going to get back to that image we just saw in a moment. So I'm going to start off with a basic 128 and 128. Now, to start things off, we're just going to do something bone dead simple, and the results should not be a surprise to anybody. I'm just going to draw a checkerboard pattern on this. Of course, whatever drawing program you use doesn't matter. I'm using GIMP. You can use MS Paint if you really wanted to. I would recommend using something that has the ability to draw checkerboard patterns or a pattern of some kind. Otherwise, this potentially could be a little bit difficult for you. So I am going for GIMP, at least. I would go to Render, Pattern, Checkerboard. And in this particular case, I'll stick with 32 pixel checkers. Draws it out. I'm going to go ahead and export this out. Now I already have this set up to export to my assets folder for this project. I'm going to call this small pattern no border. Now you'll notice that I will be using a lot of really long file names for this. You can never have too descriptive of file names for stuff like this. Remember, human memory fades fast. You might be working on your game every day, but you're not going to be working on the terrain every day, potentially. And so when you come back after a month of having not looked at the terrain, you might not remember what all these files are for. So long file names are good. That's the point of that little ramble. Moving on. So I'm going to export that out. Yeah. Defaults are good. Hop back over to GIMP. There it is. Let's add this in. So select the terrain, textures, edit, add, drag this puppy in, apply, and okay, yeah, that's hopefully what you expected to see. It's going to take that texture and it's going to repeat it across the terrain. No surprises there. All right, let's head back over to GIMP. And let's create a new 128 by 128 here. And this time I'm going to do the pattern. Let's go ahead and close you out. Don't need you anymore. I'm going to do a border. So 32 pixel actually happens to work out pretty good as a border. So I am going to grab my rectangular select tool, start drawing it in here, and my position is going to be 32, 32. And my size is going to be, oops, not 128. 64, I can count correctly, by 64. And that gives me a 25% border on the outside, leaving me 50% of the interior as my playable area. I am going to paint this interior area as green. There you are, paint can. Gonna invert my selection and then paint that area red. And I'm done. All right, let's go ahead and export this out. And I'm gonna call this small border. No pattern. I really need to get that keyboard stabilized better. I am hoping that sound isn't being picked up too much by the microphone. Alright, so now I've got that. Edit textures this time, and drag this in, and ooh, that's not what we need. Completely, totally expected, but not what we need. What I want is to be able to see that pattern, that one image, stretched out across my entire terrain. And for that, we're going to have to go back into editing, and we're going to take a look at the size. The size is kind of an odd little number. What we're saying is per unit of terrain, you know, how much of an area on the terrain should this texture take up? So by saying 1515, I am saying that for every 15 units on this terrain, I'm going to stamp this texture. If I change it up to 2525, I'm saying for every 25 units, stamp this texture. Which means if I say 700 by 700, I am saying for every 700 units, stamp one instance of this texture. Well, 700 by 700 happens to be the entire terrain size, so I stamp one instance of this across the terrain. And this does get me what I want. I can now see where that 25% boundary is. Unfortunately, for me at least, we can't stop here. This bugs me for two reasons. One, for editing. It's really hard to tell where the mountains actually are. It's the same gripe I have against that default, like, silvery, ice-like looking material or texture that is on the terrains by default. It's really kind of hard to perceive height differences with that single color. The other thing that kind of messes with things, I'm going to take the standard Unity FPS controller and drop it in here. Let's get you up so we don't seek through instantly. And excuse me, it's a little bit hard to figure out movement. I mean, I can see movement a little bit due to the shading on the hills and ridges and stuff, but beyond that, it's really hard to get a sense of movement. It's like if I position this hill just right, I almost can't even see that there's a hill there. I can see it a little bit, but I don't like it. It's too hard to see. I like clarity in my vision. So let's hop back over to GIMP and see what we can do about this. Alright, so this isn't good. We need something different. I'm actually going to get a larger image going here. Discard changes. Oops, get. And actually, this is what we're going to be working towards, is this here. So let's create a new image. Now this is a 1024 by 1024 image. I'll make you go away. So what I want is I want to combine both of these things. I want to combine that border with the checkerboard. So I'm going to start off by creating that border. Now I've already worked out the math, and in this particular case, 256 happens to be what I need for the border on this one. So I'm going to grab my rectangular tool, start it in. My position will be 256 and 256. Conversely, by the way, you could set up a grid and do snap to grids. That would work perfectly fine as well. And my size would be 512 by 512. Now, if I wanted to actually have the original, that default area 500 by 500, if I wanted to have that, well, as you can see, I would have to have a 1024 by 1024 size terrain, and that would leave me with a 512 by 512 inner plane area. With the 700 by 700, we're getting less than that, but it doesn't really matter too much for this demonstration, and honestly, it's still a pretty big area to be walking around. It really depends on what you want to do with the area. Just wanted to point that out. Okay, so I've got my inner area here, which of course needs to be green, so grab a green, bucket, tool, there you are. Drop it in, invert my selection, grab that red again, plop it down, change that back to black for the checkerboards that I'm going to draw on a different layer. And oops, nope, that's not what I meant to do. Control-Shift-A, which removes my selections. Okay, so I've got my border. Again, not what I want. I want some checkerboards on here. So I'm going to create a new layer. Now, if you're using a program that doesn't do layers, use one that does layers. You really want layers when doing image editing. You can probably just try and draw some patterns or something across this to disrupt the area, so that way you can see what's going on, but checkerboards is better. So I'm going to create a new layer, and to start off with, I'm going to do a 64 by 64 grid. So I'm going to go into my filters, I'm going to re-show my checkerboard, and I'm going to do 64 grid. Now I can't see my background, but that is simply easily corrected by modifying the transparency of this top layer here, and play around with it until you find a value that you like. I have already determined that 70% transparency works pretty good for what I like to do with this. So now that I've got this, I can export it out. Another time for another big file name. This would be 1024 64 grid 25% border. Come over here, come back into Assets, select my terrain, textures, edit, edit, drag this in, and there. Now I can see a little bit better in terms of, how things are crinkled and higher and lower and things like that. Now this grid happens to be still a little bit big. If I was working in, say, maybe a 1024 by 1024 terrain, this 64 grid would work out pretty good, but it's a little bit large. Intentionally so, actually. So let's hop back over to GIMP here. Now this is why we like doing things in layers, because now I can just simply hide this top layer, add a new one in. So I've got this layer, I'm going to simply go up to Filters, I'm going to re-show the checkerboard, and this time I'm going to do 32, change my opacity down to 70, that way everything looks the same, export that out, and while I'm here, might as well create yet another layer. This time I'm actually gonna remember to change my layer name on it this time. And repeat the same thing, only obviously I'm going to go down to a 16. Change that opacity down to 70. Oops. And export it. I can hop back over to Unity here and see how these look. So I can edit, edit, and replace it with the 32. See how that looks. Better. Replace it with the 16. I probably wouldn't want to go any smaller than 16, because when you get checkerboard patterns that are really small, well, you can depending on the quality that you're looking at the video on, you might be able to see how we're starting to get some visual distortions, especially on this image here. Checkerboard patterns does weird things to your visual perception once they get too small. But that would be tolerable and would work out pretty good when walking through, because now I've got a pretty good sense of movement as I navigate through this area. And if I wanted, just for, fun, if I wanted to try to figure out, what roughly is the size of these things, I could drop in a cube and change its scaling. I definitely don't want it scaled like that. So it looks like these are roughly 10 by 10 squares that I am dealing with, which can be important to know. Like if you're trying to measure things, you need to know where you can put certain buildings and stuff like that. Like let's say I know I've got an inn or something like that. That is 30 by 40. Well, actually, I can probably just also use a cube here and say, okay, well, you need to be a 40 by 30 thing. And so now I can just map this out, flatten out the area accordingly, so that way I know I can put my building there properly. All right, so that gets us a good pattern. It shows us our unwalkable areas. Now I'm just going to do a quick pass on trying to make that actually unwalkable. There's a couple of different techniques. I could just leave it as is. Of course, that I might still be able to see off. And for that, you're going to want to do some visual checks. Walk up to what is the area where I'm going to put my invisible walls or whatever I want to do. And can I tell that the world ends out there? Well, it's okay on those spots, and you really want to check high spots because that's where the illusion can really break sometimes. So like, this is a pretty high spot right here. Yeah, I can really tell looking out this way that that's the edge of the world right there. So that's not good. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a very quick, simple pass. I'm going to turn this into more of a sort of valley type area. And so I want to raise up these edges. Now I want my brush to be as big as I can possibly get it. So I'm going to use the fuzzy brush here, so that way there's a little bit of softness. I'm going to get it as big as I can. Let's see here, opacity 15. Does that move? Okay, I wouldn't want to go any higher than that. So let's just start getting some areas raised up here, and I'm just going to raise up the edges around here. Now the reason why I'm using the big solid brushes is that that will have the least amount of impact on the details that was generated by using the Terrain Toolkit. Try to create maybe some layer effects, but right now I'm just going for the big overarching details. And now I can check it. I'm lucky I didn't fall through the floor there. And maybe I could bring those down a little bit, but now, at least from a visual point of view, I can no longer reach the edge of the world. Now there's certainly some of these slopes might be not sloped enough that I can just walk straight up them. Also, as usual, keep in mind the default first-person character controller's pretty awful in terms of liking to walk up vertical slopes, so you do have to take that with a grain of salt. Like, I was running up those, by the way. You can run almost up any surface. But, so yeah, the next step on this is going to be taking a look and making sure that the slopes are steep enough that I can't walk up them. Now this video is getting a little bit long in the tooth, so we'll take a look at how we can use the Terrain Toolkit plus textures to evaluate our walkable area and whether or not something is steep enough that we shouldn't be able to walk up it. So, until the next video, have fun creating.